We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. They say it's to protect you, while they try to dispossess you of the right to decide between wrong or right, to openly discuss what politicians hide. They want to keep their secret plans from the public eye. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. Money got no children, and bombs ain't for building, and killing ain't no way to make a peaceful day, as all of God's children can easily explain. We gotta keep our fires burning, keep our spirits bright, stand up and speak for what we know is right. We gotta rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. I see days ahead. Kiss my children into bed. All across the planet I see that everything is fine. Yeah! Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people, against the war. Rise up, people. We got the power and the will, and we'll do it for our children, for the warmongers and the corporate whores in the history books with the dinosaurs. I claim my power, I claim my rights, and no dirty tricks are gonna change my mind. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. I'm gonna rise up, rise up, rise up. Rise up, people, against the war. 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 Rise up.
Hello, this is Dan Shea with Veterans for Peace Forum. I'm with Veterans for Peace both locally here at Chapter 72 and on the National Board. I wanted to remind you that we are on every fourth Saturday of the month. We're just coming back here, and I'm glad that you're tuning in. This is a program that's being hosted by me and my producers, Kelly Labonte and Jim Lockhart, who make this all possible at Gresham Community Media out here. And I just wanted to thank all those people that have continually supported the program as we're beginning really a new year. And we have so many new issues that'll be happening. A lot of our veterans and Veterans for Peace come from both World War II to Korea, Vietnam. Now we have Iraq and Afghanistan vets. And these issues can continually become the same issues over and over. Today I have Barry Jones, who was a Marine Grunt Platoon leader, and he became a Veterans for Peace about 7 years ago or so.
Correct.
And Barry served in the Marine Corps for about 4 years and 10 months, and was an enlisted Marine. And Barry, I just wanted to really allow you to just tell us a little bit about your history and how you guys started, why you ended up in the Marines.
Sure. I graduated from high school in 1964, and in those days
Where?
In Mentor, Ohio, east of Cleveland on Lake Erie. Okay. And in those days, as many of your viewers will know, the draft was in full force, and if you weren't physically disabled in some way or going to college, you were drafted. I came from a long line of family members, father, uncles who'd served, most of them in World War II, some in previous conflicts. So there was a family tradition of service, and I thought, well, I'll just get my military obligation, as I thought of it in those days, finished. The Vietnam War was not going at that point, so I had no clue that I was going to end up in a war or in a combat situation. I thought I would just end up doing 3 years in the Marine Corps, which one of my favorite uncles had served in, and with the GI Bill, go back to school and everything would be fine as I moved on with my life. But a year after I was in the Corps, having gone to Parris Island in September of '64, I was on one of, I think, the second boatload of Marines to go into Da Nang, South Vietnam, in June of 1965. That's when the war really started to kind of build up in terms of regular troops, both Marines as well as Army troops being shipped ashore.
So were you gung-ho Marine at that time? Were you thinking at that level?
I was as I reflect back on myself in those days, I was very politically naive and not really clued in historically as to what was happening in Southeast Asia or what the big picture was in terms of the Cold War, which we all grew up kind of experiencing in those days. I was gung-ho in the sense that I wanted to be a good Marine and to do my job well and to not let my buddies down. I can't say that I was gung-ho in terms of accomplishing some patriotic mission, because that wasn't at all clear. When we first went ashore in '65, it was characterized as kind of a guerrilla war, an insurgency, to use the term that you hear nowadays, but the same notion. And so there was no real clear objective one way or another in terms of what we were supposed to be doing there, apart from pacifying the area and reducing infiltration.
Words, like pacify. These are important words. What does that mean? Explain that to the people out there.
Well, the idea, I think, that was communicated to us in the 60s in terms of pacification in Vietnam was to prevent any kind of contact by the Viet Cong or the North Vietnamese with the South Vietnamese population, so that they couldn't somehow or another be inculcated in kind of the governmental models from the North. So that was the kind of the basic concept.
There was too, wasn't the idea of creating these sort of villages that were kind of controlled by the military, sort of control those areas as sort of pacifications that keep them isolated from. Exactly. Yeah. And it was easy and quickly people could get there if there was a conflict.
Right.
And they were just sort of almost like bait out there in a sense.
Which really disenfranchised, looking back on it, the South Vietnamese who were subjected to that kind of treatment. They were pulled off of their farms, their rice paddies, and resettled in essentially kind of refugee camps where they had no real ownership of anything. And protected from their brothers from the North.
Protect you. And give you your democratic rights. So we were talking earlier just about, you had just actually communicated with an old Marine that served with you, and it brought up some things for you. Can you talk about that a little bit?
The man that Dan is referring to is a Marine, old Marine, I think of ourselves now as older Marines. Once a Marine, always a Marine. I didn't realize what that really meant when I was young. His name is Chuck Van Bibber, and he lives back in North Carolina. And he was my machine gun squad leader in 1968, and I hadn't really had any contact with him for almost 45 years now. And we just recently got connected through another Marine that we both had a contact with, and have been exchanging emails and reminiscing some. And one of the memories that has come out of this exchange with Chuck recently was, for me, was how physically miserable we were much of the time when we were out in the field. And I hadn't really processed that among the many, many memories that are associated with having been in combat on two separate tours, as we call them. So that, I think, is what you were referring to.
Right. And how did that make you feel when you're connecting with him? Did it bring up specific memories for you as you're talking with him?
It brought up a lot of, initially, kind of favorable memories. He was someone that I respected. At the time, I was his lieutenant, so we weren't buddies in the usual sense of the word, but I liked him, I respected him, and it just felt good after all these years to have some sense of continuity with someone who was there when I was there, when we were both young and kind of relatively innocent. So those were favorable feelings.
Now, and so just wanted a little technical thing here. I'm hearing a little bit of an echo. So just for my producers here to kind of check on. But other than that, we were talking, I'm telling you some experiences that I had in Vietnam. And I remember, there were things like smells and the helicopters and you were talking earlier too how difficult we had to live. I slept in mud puddles. I hadn't had blankets. People tell me now, you need to get out in nature, and I said, I had enough of nature. I'm a city boy. Vietnam, you name it, that's, I don't want to live like that anymore. But you brought up that idea, how rough we as veterans live, but we have to also think about what was it like for the Vietnamese. We are invading their territory, and they had gone through the Japanese, the French, all of these different wars over so many years, and just for what? Trying to live out their lives, to live with growing their food to feed their children, and here we are. I can't even imagine how miserable life was for them.
I agree, and that really hit me squarely between the eyes, so to speak, in February of 1968, when I was sent back to Vietnam a second time, following Tet of '68, which many folks know about, whether they served in the military or not. That was kind of the turning point, if you will, in the political support of the war.
No, we may have a lot of young people watching that might not even know what Tet is. You want to explain
Tet
that
is the Vietnamese New Year, which is quite a celebration and tradition in both North and South Vietnam. A major cultural ritual occurs during that time, and there was a historical tradition. I believe it went back even to the war with the French, between the Viet Minh and the French, that they would have an armistice, kind of a peace. What's another term for armistice? Kind of a
truce.
A truce.
Yeah.
For a few days during the Vietnamese New Year, and that had been honored for some time whenever there was an ongoing conflict. But in 1968, the North Vietnamese, used that so-called truce as an opportunity to launch a major assault in the South, which was countrywide and very, very intense and profound in terms of just the scale. And got lots of media attention, and it was really an eye-opener, I think, for many Americans who had previously thought that the war was a reasonable cause. And I think,
And a done deal.
right, right. And they also thought that, yes, that it was a done deal, that we were winning the war, the hearts and minds, and all of a sudden it looked as though it was a major reversal. And at that time, I was sent personally, along with a whole nother regiment of Marines, the 27th Marine Regiment, back into Vietnam as reinforcements to kind of follow up on the heels of Tet. Does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, it did. But then you were talking about how that changed you.
Right. So when I got there in February of '68, on the tail end of Tet, the major combat had subsided quite a bit. The North Vietnamese Army units had been driven out of the Da Nang area. And I actually went back with my unit, 2nd Battalion, 27th Marines, into an area outside of Da Nang, southwest of Da Nang, that I had been in 3 years earlier. I knew the countryside. I knew all of the terrain. I'd been through a lot of the villages 3 years previously when things were very low-key in terms of the war. And I was shocked and appalled at the devastation of the countryside. Physically, things had just been torn up as the result of the combat. A lot of the villages had been abandoned, or the civilian Vietnamese, the farmers, had been pulled out of those villages, as you indicated earlier, and put into those kind of resettlement camps. The Vietnamese civilians who were friendly and curious about Americans in 1965, when we first went in, were alienated by 1968. They didn't want to talk to you. They didn't want to be around you. Even many of the kids would be very wary about getting close to Marines. So it was real clear to me as a young Marine at that point that things had gone south in significant ways, and that we may be involved in what we think of today as kind of a lost cause.
Well, that's interesting, because I know when I was there, we're both Marines, and I remember when I got there, I was in '68. I came in August of '68, and one of the things that when I first hooked up with my unit was that they would say, "Dan, you're not here for apple pie and American flag, patriotism stuff is, forget it," using other kind of language that we spoke in. But they did say, somebody shoots at you, we fight back. We're here to save each other's lives. And they said they didn't have any animosities toward the Vietnamese, the guys I was with. I'm not saying that's not true of everyone, but they were basically saying, and the guys on the other side are doing the same thing. And I was a bit surprised by that, but that's what I learned right off the bat. So as you're talking about this, was there discussion when you had that sort of realization among the troops themselves? Was there a discussion about, you were an officer, so you're in almost a different position sometimes, but even among officers there must have been discussion, what are we doing here?
Yes. And I think, in a sense, kind of behind closed doors, we all had the similar kind of understanding that this is about taking care of each other and surviving as best we can, and moving on.
Yeah. there's usually sort of an animosity between the grunt and the officers in a lot of ways. But I do remember a lieutenant who actually seemed to be very aware. I remember going through, we're on a search and destroy mission, and what that means is when you're in a search and destroy mission, that anything is a target, and nobody's supposed to be in that area. Supposedly they even send out flyers letting people know they better not be in the way. But we're going through we're through the jungle, but there's an open area, and you can see this guy out there with his water buffalo and doing the farm and his rice paddies or whatever he was growing there, and people wanted to fire him. He was a target right away, and this lieutenant just said, "No, we're not going to do that. I don't care what the orders are." And I think I gained some respect for him, that he would say, "No, this is somebody who's innocent," and he was only ready to fight if we were fired upon. Mm-hmm. That's the feeling I got from him. Mm-hmm. That's what I remember. and you don't hear that a lot when you watch war movies and you see these guys just ready to fire on anything. And nowadays, I mean, these movies are so brutal.
Right.
And I wonder what these kids think of what war is about. But most of the guys I knew really were in a position to try and avoid conflict wherever they could.
And I think that was pretty commonplace for most of the Marines that I had contact with and served with in 1968 too. Mm-hmm. At kind of the platoon and company level. I can't speak for the officers. But the field grade colonels and majors and generals, they may have thought they were still executing some grand plan, but I certainly didn't have that feeling at that point. And getting back to a point you made a moment ago too, Dan, about our adversaries, the North Vietnamese, I think as Marine grunts, we had a great deal of grudging respect for the North Vietnamese. They were good soldiers. They were tough, and they knew their business, so to speak. And so we certainly didn't take anything for granted. And
now, another thing is, I've told you, I'm an Agent Orange victim, and of course we know around Da Nang area and Phu Bai and those areas there was a lot of spraying, as there was in South Vietnam, further south. But you said you saw those planes spraying. Tell people what you saw.
In the outskirts of the coastal plain southwest of Da Nang, when the coastal plain would start to go up into the mountains towards the Laotian border, we would often run platoon-sized patrols in that countryside. And many of the villas had been abandoned, or the civilians had been pulled out of those villages by the time I was patrolling that area with my men. But it wasn't uncommon that we would see C-130s, those large four-engine turboprop transport planes that were kind of workhorses in Marine aviation and Air Force aviation too, flying kind of wingtip to wingtip with some kind of spraying device that they'd be just spraying this Agent Orange all over the foliage. You wouldn't notice anything for a few weeks, maybe 3 or 4 weeks, and if you went back through that same terrain a month later, it was real obvious that something very toxic had happened there, and things were defoliating, and it just had a very bizarre kind of surreal look, and we didn't fully appreciate at the time, of course, what the implications of having this powerful toxic chemical.
We didn't know.
No, in the water, in the soil.
Right.
It was literally every place.
And it was designed, I mean, they said it was designed to kill the foliage so that they couldn't sneak up on you, you know. And,
right.
But it wasn't supposed to be used on crops, and it was. it was used in, and that was considered a war crime to have sprayed crops where people needed to feed their the local people. And if you're trying to win the hearts and minds of people, that was not one way to do it. One of the things I think of today is that I remember, as I told you before, I served in Vietnam, but also in the Philippines. In the Philippines, the jungles were incredibly alive. I mean, I was there in guard duty, but at the same time, I was in the jungle quite often, walking these posts. And I mean, there were monkeys and birds, and I mean, the jungle sang. I mean, and it was beautiful and scary and all kinds of things. But at the same time, when I think back of Vietnam, when I was walking through there, everything was dead. The only things that were alive were the rats, the mosquitoes, and scorpions, things like that. I rarely saw any animals.
That was pretty much true. Interesting to hear you describe it that way, Dan. Pretty much true in my experience, too.
Yeah.
The only two forms of wildlife that I personally observed were some, what we called, I'm not sure what the native or the civilian Vietnamese called them, we called them rock apes. They were
rock apes. They weren't around when I was
small. They were smaller than a chimpanzee, but bigger than a monkey.
Yeah.
What we as North Americans think of when we talk about these animals that aren't indigenous to our country. And they would often hang around our fortified positions like a fire base,
Right.
scrounging.
Right.
Because there were always sea ration cans, half-empty sea ration cans laying around that they would get into. And I saw a couple of snakes.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, almost sat on one at one point in time. And one of my men saw this happening and probably saved my life because it was a bamboo viper that we called the two-step. And he saw me sitting down. I didn't see the snake. We were in heavy brush at the time.
Right.
And he kicked me and sent me flying. And then he pointed down at the spot that I was going to sit, and there was that poisonous snake sitting right on top of my gear. So that was a very clear memory that I will never forget.
Yeah, that's strange because I remember, one time just checking my boots before putting them on, and scorpions coming out. Yeah, shaking them out of there. But the reason I raised that about there, I did hear guys tell me that they had they called rock apes that were around, and they also told me that there used to be tigers and stuff in that area. Yeah, I would hear the guns from way off, either I don't know where they were coming from, Da Nang or wherever, but big guns firing off in the background, and I would hear, maybe sometimes rockets and stuff being called in from ship to support people that were out in the field. And you could hear those guns go off at night, or during the day, and just bang. You knew they were some distance away, but the noise is one thing, and then again the spraying, and then the battles were certainly affecting nature and the animals that live there. I'm sure Agent Orange killed a lot of life. Not only, just their food source was gone.
Right.
So this changed it. So when we think of war, we think of the things, of course, the loss of our friends, the loss of innocent people that were caught in the middle of these things, and of course our so-called enemies, many of these people's lives that were lost in these battles. But nature itself has been devastated because of war, and we forget about that. It's often not raised. And if we're talking to environmentalists out there, this is another reason that we need to come together as both environmentalists and veterans and people talking about the war, because our planet is faced with these disasters that are left after war. And today, just this last year, they just started cleaning up some of the Agent Orange hotspots around Da Nang, and finding out new releases that are happening where we found that Agent Orange barrels were dumped in Korea area, and now they're talking about, I think it was Okinawa or someplace like that. So we're learning that, these many years later, that those countries are still suffering from that. People are victims. I don't know, were you affected by Agent Orange, or that you know of in any way? Or?
Not in any way that I know of. That's the basic answer to your question. I sometimes wonder, I'm 66 now, and have a little bit of what I think a physician would call peripheral neuropathy in my lower legs and feet, and that's my diagnosis. I haven't had an official diagnosis.
Yeah.
But I think that's one of the symptoms that's sometimes associated with Agent Orange.
Yeah. And with diabetes.
And I'm okay in terms of diabetes.
Yeah. Okay.
And I had a recent physical, so I know that those kinds of things are checked out. But that could well be some kind of side effect for me personally of Agent Orange exposure.
I'm getting people who online, actually, there's a group called Daughters of Veterans, Facebook page. I was introduced to a young woman who's had loss of, was born without some limbs, and has organized other children of veterans. Stories that are untold, the stories that the VA still denies, in the sense that male veterans that served, if their children or offspring had anything but spina bifida, weren't considered connected to Agent Orange. Female veterans, of course, that was extended. But we're learning that, since I got connected with this young people, this next generation, there is one story after another story. And in fact, I was getting so much, I almost had to say, well, where do we stop? How come this isn't being recorded? One of the great things about the social media we have now is that people can tell their stories, and people are starting to come together and graduate to tell what is happening. So if you're out there and go online and look up something about daughters of, if you're a veteran, or just children of Vietnam veterans, if you know of somebody who has a physical anomaly, is very sick and they can't figure out what it is, it's a good idea to check out, if their parents were in areas that were associated to Agent Orange. If you are a refugee from Vietnam, many of those Vietnamese who are in the South, boat people that came here, their children also were affected by that, and a lot of those people never said anything. Sort of a silent majority of people out there that have suffered that are starting to speak out. So it's a good idea to check those out. We need to make sure that reparations is paid for the fault of Monsanto and DuPont and all these chemical companies that continually, Monsanto, there's a lawsuit out there right now just for Roundup that's being used, and that environmentalists and veterans and others are constantly trying to raise the issue of them poisoning our planet. We need to make sure that profit isn't the only reason that they're in business, that we need to make sure that there's safety and concerns for human beings and nature. And Agent Orange is one of the most toxic chemicals ever produced by accident. These things coming together and sort of mixing chemicals, and they knew what they were doing when they put it out there. They knew that it was a dangerous chemical, but it was profitable to go ahead and continue to use that, and they certainly had the military and our tax dollars to pay for it. And now we have people that are suffering these many years later. Myself and I have many friends and people I've met who actually died many years after the war because of Agent Orange. But there's also, you're a psychologist.
Correct.
And there's also the idea that, post-traumatic stress is another thing. There's a trauma that happens to people who've been to war. We talked a little earlier, my sort of a metaphor here being, that if your car is wrecked and it's scarred up.
That's a good metaphor.
Yeah, it's wrecked and torn up and flat tires. You can replace the tires. You can pull out the dents, but that car's been damaged and it has its scars, but it can go on, and it can be a fairly good vehicle for you to continue. It keeps moving. But those hidden scars, and for a veteran, we can get better. I want people to know that. But their scars are there, and they're not going to go away. And we need to how to deal with it. And as a psychologist, you're dealing with these issues. And you have any thoughts that you want to express about how veterans come to you and why, what causes these? What's your definition of post-traumatic? Maybe that's a good place to start. What's the definition of post-traumatic stress, and what are the symptoms?
Well, if we just start with the term post-traumatic stress, what it implies conceptually is that there is not necessarily an immediate response to wartime trauma or combat by veterans, or by civilians for that matter too, that there may be quite a delay between time A, when a trauma occurs, or a series of traumas occur, and when there's an emotional or psychological reaction. So that's the post-traumatic notion of what happens with traumatic stress. In my own case, just to personalize it some, it was fully 10 years after I was medically discharged from the Corps as the result of wounds received in combat that I had a personal experience 10 years later. I was already a psychologist by then. That reflected my first personal response of what we now refer to as post-traumatic stress disorder. So that was kind of a grieving scenario. I had not previously, as a young Marine officer, had an opportunity to grieve in a usual kind of ritualized, healthy way the loss of my friends and fellow Marines. And 10 years later, that process kind of hit me emotionally, and it started to happen at that point in time. And since then, that was in 1980 or so, it's been a constant kind of recovery process. So I think of it as a lifelong recovery process now that's kind of developmental, in the sense that we go through different stages of our lives, young adulthood, middle age, and of our senior years. At each one of these developmental stages, we're going to be facing certain challenges, psychological challenges related to those early experiences of trauma. Does that make some sense?
Yeah, the reason I raise it, I mean, there's also, there's a lot of suicides from veterans from our era to the present number of Iraq and Afghan vets who've gone through 3 to 4 to 7 tours already, you know.
It's hardly imaginable for those of us who...
We can't even imagine that. But the thing is that when I think about, most people think about post-traumatic stress as they think about it as a trauma of war. Maybe they saw a friend get killed, or they were in a battle, or they killed somebody. But there's also, for me, is the idea that there were many veterans who were in the back who also are suffering from post-traumatic stress. I'm sure you ran across people who are...
Which is very real.
Yeah. And how does that differ? As a psychologist, how would you describe the difference, if any? Excuse me.
Generally speaking, purely from a psychological perspective, Dan, I don't think there is a difference. Once trauma occurs, regardless of how it happens, trauma is trauma. So once that kind of threshold is crossed, psychologically speaking, even though the events that produce the trauma could be very different superficially, it could be a gunshot wound, could be an airplane crash, it could be an automobile accident, very different kinds of events can produce the same kinds of traumatic experiences psychologically, with the same kind of sequelae or after effects in the individual. And that's often very confusing for individuals in general, some people who really went through what we used to refer to as the meat grinder,
Right.
we kind of expect that they're going to have post-traumatic experiences. And someone else who was perhaps a cook in the rear with the gear, as we used to say, could very well have post-traumatic stress too as the result of worrying about rockets coming in on his mess hall every
Right.
night, even though that was a very different experience than the man in direct combat experienced. And
Yeah.
there's quite a continuum in
Well,
between.
too, I think, there are people I've seen that were even in the States that never went over. I actually was in contact with a guy who wrote a book about his life, a guy named Jerry Rosen. But he, I think he called it cold eye, warm heart. He just passed away. He had leukemia. But he was actually somebody who was an officer who sent people to Vietnam, and they didn't come back. And his guilt for sending him, he became an anti-war activist. Was one of those people who was out there when Daniel Ellsberg was still in the Pentagon, who was on the outside with the flowers in the rifles, as he was still in the military, and he realized that. But he had post-traumatic stress. I mean, just the very idea that he sent people. I find too that people felt that didn't serve, weren't in the physical combat area, but felt they had a conscience, and they were part of a system that was killing people.
Right. They felt responsible.
They felt responsible,
personal.
and why couldn't they stand up against it? And they took that, and they are suffering post-traumatic stress. And I want people to realize how traumatic war itself is. Because for me, it's not just my trauma that I experienced in being in combat, but the very betrayal of my government that lied to me. It was interesting on radio Friday. There's a guy named Marvin Simmons, Byers, who do a program on KBU, veterans program, and they I think it was doing the fundraising thing, but they were interviewing a guy named David Swanson who wrote a book called War is a Lie. And I just love that title. I mean, it should be our motto, War is a Lie. And
reminds me of Smedley Butler's book, War is Also a Racket.
War is a Racket, yeah, both of these. But what it was interesting in that conversation, he was saying that, the reason he chose that title, he says, because they don't tell you, nobody would go to war if they were telling you why they were going to war. We're going to war for corporations. We're going to gather slaves. We're going to go and exploit people. We're going to steal their land or their resources, their oil. Nobody's going to go to war for those reasons, so they have to fabricate an enemy, a reason to go, weapons of mass destruction.
Create fear in
some way. And to rally people around somehow to go to these wars, create an enemy. They have to create an enemy to go to war because there's no real reason to do that. So all wars are lies in a sense. And for me, that's the continuation, as we both said when we were talking to each other, is that our post-traumatic stress was triggered like in the Gulf War period, It just seemed to me right away I knew it was a lie that, and the minute they started bombing, I could feel thousands of lives being destroyed in a moment, and I just empathetically, I could feel it in my soul, in my body, and it pissed me off, and at the same time, it made me angry, but I was trying to figure, what can I do now? What can I do to stop this? But it made me depressed, and started triggering these post-traumatic stress sort of symptoms in me, and I began to realize
common, understandable kind of reactions to a feeling of betrayal.
Right, and it's continuing, and it continues, and I don't think that anybody's going to be healed in the long term if we continue these sort of wars, and if our culture doesn't change. And culture, I mean, you see this occupation movement out there that's really hopeful to me. One of the most hopeful things I've seen in my lifetime.
I agree.
And to see that these young people are saying, we've had enough. They're on the edge. We've had enough. enough of war, enough of the destruction of our economy, our planet. The planet is at the verge of destruction, and we can't live like this anymore. We need to do something. And for me, that's the most hopeful thing, because it's changing culture.
And we're doing something nonviolently.
Nonviolently, that's right. They're not going to war for this. Right. They're sitting down and saying, we won't cooperate.
And it's inclusive.
It's very inclusive, and what recently just called diversity of tactics. You know, they're accepting. Not everybody agrees on what the tactics are, but we want to understand that there is a nonviolent approach, and this is the most meaningful to our communities. They understand it and they can reach out. I think that, I mean, there have been many revolutions in the world. You know, we've seen in Latin America and Viet Nam, and one of them fought with weapons and guerrilla warfare, but it seems like when they turn it around, eventually violence begets violence,
yes.
and people get in power, and those sometimes wrong people get in power, and they repeat the same oppression that they went to war in the first place. Mm-hmm. And it seems to me the only way that we're going to ever break that cycle is if we can create a revolution without violence.
I agree.
And maybe we can continue a world without violence. And maybe that's, that's my hope, my dream. And I think that's sort of the motto of Veterans for Peace, or people in the peace communities. You joined Veterans for Peace. What did that mean to you when you joined Veterans for Peace?
I had been involved, as I'm sure viewers have gathered by now, in the mental health community for years as a psychologist, kind of working behind the scenes with veterans and their families, and other patient groups also, of course. And as I became more aware of my own personal experiences with trauma and different events in history, recent history, like the series of second Gulf Wars in Afghanistan and my response to those, it became evident to me that personally I needed to be more active in a public way. I needed to be more kind of assertive with my views in a way that would help others understand the insights that I developed over time, the kind of things that you've been talking about this evening too. That led me to the Veterans for Peace.
I also find it healing.
Yes.
For me.
Yes.
You feel that way?
I think one of the things I was feeling with the relatively new round of wars following 9/11 was total loss of control in terms of influencing or affecting kind of my public sphere, if you will.
It was a sort of, I heard the term powerlessness.
Yes.
You know?
Helpless.
Yeah.
Powerlessness. And becoming a VFP member, in a sense, kind of gave me a new feeling of engagement. I'm doing something. I'm associating with like-minded people. We don't agree on everything, of course.
Right.
That's fine. That's to be expected. But we all are focused on these goals of peace, social justice, inclusion.
Well, I think that's another thing. People, trying to understand what Veterans for Peace is. I know there are a lot of veterans out there. There's a number of veterans organizations. We are really a sort of peace and justice organization of people who happen to be veterans, and we speak with a veteran's voice, and oftentimes reason the main public will listen to us is it gives us a sort of a privileged position to speak, because I think there are people out there that are speaking this from their faith communities, from individual people who've been opposed to war for a long time, but somehow we're given some sort of platform, and because we were there, and we can tell our truth, our story.
And we've made sacrifices.
We made sacrifices, and they, although I wished I had taken the position of some people that said, I will not go, I will refuse to go. I admire those GI resistors, those draft dodgers, those people who did it with purpose. You know, so not everybody did it with purpose.
Based on principle.
Yeah, based on a principle. And I'm thinking that if you out there who are maybe a veteran or know a veteran, you know, that one of the things that they need to think about is, what is it about Veterans for Peace if you're not joining? Is it that why aren't you joining? I mean, I would like to know that. Because we're inclusive. We don't attack those people who are serving. It's not a, you know, we have no judgment against people who join the military. We are basically saying we wish, you know, we had not engaged in war, but I was 19 years old. I believed in a lot of things that were going on, or even if I didn't believe, I thought, you know, maybe I could change things. There are people that go in for those reasons too. And then realize, you know, that you don't have a voice once you get in there. You're under orders, and you have to abide by those military rules and regulations, or go to the brig or jail. And but we have people out there like Bradley Manning, who's a whistleblower, who went for all the same reasons that a lot of people do in this world.
Idealistic reasons.
Idealistic reasons, and ends up, you know, seeing that something horribly wrong went on in the war, and exposed that what was it, the helicopter firing in on the sort of reporters.
The collateral murder film or something like that.
Collateral murder video, yeah. And that was the beginning of sort of WikiLeaks exposure to so many military, not just military, but embassies and all kinds of information that being released, what our government and other governments are involved in, what a lie the war was, and how atrocious the violence was, and what this was really murder, sanctioned murder by war. And there were people, you know, to fire in on these two young kids that were in that van that were just trying to pick up people that were wounded. I think people need to see those things and understand. We still don't judge those Marines that are soldiers that fired. We're saying you put people into these situations, bad things are going to happen, and there's no clean war. You're going to create monsters. You know, you're going to create situations that people are going to lose their moral compass. They're not originally bad people, and they may regain. I want them to know too, they can regain that moral compass, because you're not even yourself when you're in those situations. That's something that you could probably address somewhat. I mean, there are people who've done things who may feel so guilty that they can't be healed.
Can't be healed. Well, healing, I kind of come back to that idea that it's a recovery process.
Process, yeah.
Yes, that it's an ongoing kind of process, and that that there can be recovery and health, relatively speaking, psychological health as well as physical health at different stages along the individual kind of lifespan.
Right.
But some individuals have been so traumatized by what they've seen or done that they avoid the resources like the Veterans Administration or different treatment programs that would help them, but they can't even go there. They can't even make that kind of contact.
I know that feeling. I couldn't go for years. I would not have anything to do with anything that was military. I would not go to the VA. I went to VA once, and I felt so humiliated in this process. And that when I finally decided I needed to do it, you know, that I couldn't go through the bureaucracy of the paperwork. But then somebody told me, well, there's help out there. Other people will fill out that work for you. They'll help you get through this. It's funny. I could not put my hand on that paperwork if it meant saving my life, you know. I didn't know what that was, but now when you say that, that's so true, that people can't do that.
And that's real common. One of the way to think of that is the difficulty with authority. And our government was the ultimate authority that we felt betrayed by.
Right.
And anything that represents authority at that point, even if it's a helping kind of authority,
Right.
is difficult to accept and reach out to.
Well, I think that we're going to have to wrap up here, and I want to, just say to people out there, talk to a vet, check out Veterans for Peace, and if Veterans for Peace isn't for you, check out any of the other veterans organizations that are out there that might be able to help. But talk to a vet if that's a trouble for you, or if you're a family member, because there's secondhand post-traumatic stress also, and I think people need to be aware of that. Barry, I want to thank you for coming on the program. It was very important.
Thank you, Dan, for the invitation.
And it's never enough time because we could talk for hours on this.
One thought for your viewers would be, if they're so inclined, the National Veterans for Peace website is an excellent one, has lots of useful links for people who are concerned about the issues that we've discussed this afternoon.
That's right.
www.veteransforpeace.org will get you there, and thanks for
It's up there on the screen.
listening.